If you've been following my channel for a while, you probably know that I don't do follow-up videos all that often. The subject of Hulk Hogan's dishonesty was one of those rare topics that I actually saw myself returning to sometime in the future, because, as I said in my first video, it's such an extensive topic. Even I didn't think we'd be back here this soon though. In the short time since I released my first Hulk Hogan video, a few stories have resurfaced while other new ones have emerged. One piece of information regarding the infamous Hulkster in Heaven song seemed so important to me upon hearing it that I felt the need to put out a follow-up video back to back with the first one, but we'll get to that soon. The first story I want to talk about isn't new, but when the information came to light, it caused a bit of a stir on social media. On April 16th of 2024, the Twitter account Bukamania89 posted an old clip of Hulk Hogan where he took credit for Mark Calaway getting into the WWF and being given his legendary Undertaker gimmick. In the clip, Hogan claims that after bringing Calaway in to film the movie Suburban Commando, he personally took Mark to meet Vince McMahon, where Vince gave him the Undertaker gimmick right on the spot. Quote, "We became really good friends. Once we were done, I said, 'Man, you gotta come to New York.' So I brought Mark Calaway in to meet Vince McMahon. Vince took a long look at him, looked him up and down, and he was a monster at 6'10" and in really good shape. And Vince goes, 'I'm gonna call you the Undertaker.' I just said, 'Oh my God, Vince.' You know we've been training, saying our prayers, and eating our vitamins. This will never work." The body bags and dead people, but I was wrong on that. So the Undertaker was born. Vince McMahon named Mark Calaway the Undertaker right in front of my very eyes when I brought him in from LA. End quote. 9 days later, this quote was reposted by Cultaholic Wrestling, and from there it made the rounds on social media and various websites. Interestingly, this clip has been up on YouTube for 9 years. But for one reason or another, it appears to have been removed from Hulk's own website and YouTube channel. As I said earlier, this story isn't exactly new. Hogan actually told the same story, almost verbatim, in his 2002 autobiography. Unfortunately for Hogan, he also unknowingly contradicted his own story when he said that he worked on Suburban Commando with Mark Calaway in 1991. While the movie came out in 1991, most of the filming was done in late 1990. This is important because Calaway had already been signed to the WWF in October of 1990 and was performing as the Undertaker character. Fun fact, the character's name was initially Kane the Undertaker, but the Kane part was dropped fairly quickly and later given to his storyline brother, played by Mayor of Knox County, Glenn Jacobs. Additional fun fact, the movie Suburban Commando was supposed to be a vehicle for Arnold Schwarzenegger and Danny DeVito, but they must have realized what a giant turd it was, so they bailed to make Twins instead. This probably turned out to be the right idea because Twins was a massive box office hit that made Schwarzenegger and DeVito filthy rich, whereas Suburban Commando is largely remembered for being the subject of a Nostalgia Critic review. Hogan would end up taking the role of intergalactic hero Shep Ramsey, while DeVito's role, I presume, would go to Christopher Lloyd.
"I was frozen today!"
Setting aside the catastrophic embarrassment that was Suburban Commando, we know that Hulk's claims about his hand in the creation of The Undertaker are false because multiple people have directly contradicted him, specifically The Undertaker himself. Calaway has described how, after hitting his ceiling with WCW and being told that nobody would pay to watch him wrestle, he was fed up with the promotion and decided to leave for the WWF. Through connections with Paul Heyman and Bruce Pritchard, Mark was able to eventually secure a meeting with Vince McMahon. Unfortunately, McMahon didn't have a job for him at the time. This was in spite of the fact that Calaway had already handed in his notice to WCW. Mark would spend a period of time in limbo, fearing that he would end up being given the mysterious egg gimmick that the WWF was building up on TV at the time. It was during this period of downtime that Mark would become involved with Suburban Commando, which he refers to as the worst movie ever.
Suburban Commando?
Worst movie ever.
According to Calaway, after he had the initial meeting with Vince in the WWF, they later called him asking him to read for the role of Hutch in the movie, which he said kept him busy for a while.
They did within a few weeks. They called me and said, "Hey, Hogan's doing this movie out in LA. They wanted me to go read for it." And I read for the movie. I got the part.
You're a dead man, Ramsey.
Ultimately, Mark would receive a phone call from Vince, and the rest is history. This story lines up with the brief window between Suburban Commando beginning principal photography in late September of 1990 and Calloway making his on-screen debut as The Undertaker at Survivor Series on November 22nd of that year. Bruce Pritchard has told a very similar version of the story as well, adding that he pitched the Undertaker character as the yin to his yang of the Brother Love character, and Pritchard did manage the Undertaker early in his WWF career. So we have at least two different people telling an entirely different story from Hogan's account. Is it theoretically possible that while working with Calloway on Suburban Commando, Hogan put in some kind of good word for him with Vince McMahon? There is a very slim chance, but it's technically possible. It's simply hard to give him the benefit of doubt in this situation where there is a minor chance that something he said may have a small sliver of truth to it. In particular because he definitely did not bring Mark to meet Vince in New York where Vince christened Calloway as The Undertaker right then and there. Multiple people contradict that story. This is also without taking into consideration the other story Hogan told for multiple decades about Undertaker injuring his neck despite knowing it was not true. Curiously, this is not the first or only time Hulk Hogan has claimed to have some hand in a well-known wrestler's development. The story that people often bring up these days is Hogan claiming to notice Kevin Owens before anyone else did. As far as I can tell, the first time Hogan ever brought this subject up was back on June 23rd of 2015 when he spoke to Rolling Stone magazine. During this interview, he credits Kevin Owens with temporarily making him believe in wrestling again. Quote, Kevin actually reminds me of the older wrestlers of the late 70s, some of those guys that didn't have the build, but they would scare you if you met them in a bar. What hooked me about him was that I was watching a match of his on NXT, and I found myself disassociated with being in the moment. All of a sudden, I started watching him, and he made me believe again. I watched real close, and there were no holes in his boat. His punches, his kicks, everything he did looked like it was killing the guy, which it probably was. He caught me with my guard down, and he made me a believer again. He hooked me. He's got that look, man, that demeanor and that swagger. End quote. It's honestly a pretty nice sentiment from a guy like Hogan who is infamous for not putting other wrestlers over. At least at this early stage, he's also not taking credit for Owens' rise through the WWE. Yet. By November of 2015, this would change. Before we go any further, it's important to note a few timeline details. Kevin Owens was signed to NXT, which is the WWE's developmental brand, back in August of 2014. By May of 2015, he was brought to the main WWE roster and quickly put into a storyline with John Cena. Hogan would end up being fired by the WWE in July of 2015 after audio of him saying racial slurs during a sex tape was leaked. So there is about an 11-month period of overlap where Owens and Hogan were both working for the WWE at the same time. When Hogan was interviewed by Radio Yorkshire in November of 2015, he had changed his story a small but noticeable amount.
Well, I hate to brag about it, but I'm the first one that pointed the finger at Kevin Owens. You know,
that you did.
I saw him on NXT like his second match, and I saw him just chopping meat and grinding and beating his guy down and doing it the old school way, and really understanding how to get heat, doing it the old school way. And I said, that's the guy. That's the guy. I don't care if he looks like a wrestler, if he looks like an ice cream salesman, I don't give a shit. That's the guy.
Slander against ice cream salesmen aside, we've gone from Hogan being impressed with Kevin's abilities to now being the first one to point the finger at him, in the span of just a few months. In August of 2016, Owens would win the vacant WWE Universal Championship, and Hogan took to Twitter to congratulate his brother. This is where Hogan seems to change his story pretty significantly and starts taking credit for Owens' success. During a seemingly now deleted episode of the Bischoff on Wrestling podcast, the Hulkster added a detail about speaking to Triple H about Owens after watching him at NXT. Quote, I told Triple H, this kid Kevin Owens, no matter how he looks physically and no matter what you think about him, when he walks out, he's over in such a weird way. I told Triple H, if you get this guy up and running, he can turn into one of your greatest baby faces. End quote. When we jump ahead to 2019 and Hogan's appearance on the Steve Austin show, the story changed even further.
When I saw Kevin Owens,
I saw him in NXT, and I watched 2 of his matches, and I watched him really grind. I watched him really chop meat, and I went, okay, there's a brother right there that's got heat. Everybody I talked to at the WWE wasn't real high on him like I was at the time. You know, the look, a lot of things, you know, that he didn't have going for him, they kind of pointed out, but I said, no, I'm telling you, you give this guy a chance to get over, he'll chop meat and he'll grind and this and that and the other. And so I was kind of like betting on the farm, and I didn't even know Kevin. I just ran my mouth and I said, you know, there's a guy in NXT that I saw then, so I think he could really get over.
So within the span of about 4 years, Hogan went from simply being a big fan of Kevin Owens to being the only one to notice his talent and actively pleading his case with people working for the WWE at the time, including Triple H. It's a pretty classic Hogan technique. Change the story a little bit with each telling and make it more and more grandiose, putting yourself at the center of it. It's possible that he really did like Kevin Owens' matches in NXT, but he was definitely not the first one to point the finger at him. I mean, the guy got signed to NXT and brought up to the main roster within 9 months, and then quickly put into a storyline with one of the biggest stars in the history of the company, and picked up a win over him less than 2 weeks later. Clearly, people noticed him and believed he had potential. It would be easy to assume that Hogan is just misremembering, and I can understand why people would be willing to cut him some slack. But after looking at so many of his stories, you start to notice the patterns. We're not talking about 30 years ago. It took him 5 months to go from saying he was a huge fan of Owens to saying he was the first person to notice his potential. As time has gone by, Hogan has only increased the amount of credit he's taken for Owens' success. It just feels deliberate. While it's far from the worst of Hogan's tall tales, I think the Kevin Owens story illustrates how he moves the goalpost with each retelling of a story. So at the end of the day, it becomes all but impossible to know where the truth ends and the embellishment begins, at least without hard evidence. Which brings me to Hogan's recent interview with the 700 Club. Now, Hogan's relationship with Christ and his born-again status is a deep topic in and of itself. But let's not get into that here. Maybe we'll save it for another video. This is just to say that when Hogan appeared on the 700 Club wearing a John 3:16 shirt and saying he's a meat suit filled with the Spirit of Christ, it wasn't completely unusual. Hogan spends a lot of the interview talking about his faith and how he was born again, which makes sense, but there are still some odd comments made during the interview. For instance, when he was asked about the greatest moment for him in his pro wrestling career, he brought up beating the Iron Sheik for the WWF title.
January 23rd, 1984, where I wrestled the Iron Sheik for the WWF title.
What's interesting here is that Hogan got the date right. It did happen on January 23rd of 1984. He did also add in an odd tidbit about the Iran hostage crisis and claimed that Iran had 444 American hostages.
Iran had 444 American hostages, and they were keeping our Americans. And
couple problems here. The Iran hostage crisis lasted 444 days from November 4th, 1979 to January 20th, 1981. So this event ended 3 years before Hogan wrestled the Sheik. Curiously, Hogan also doesn't mention this in either of his 2 books, despite discussing the match with the Iron Sheik in both of them. That being said, it's somewhat impressive that he was this close to getting it right. It's not like he said he asked George W. Bush to let him free the hostages with Hulkamania in 1989 or whatever he would normally say. Another odd moment from the interview came when Hogan was reminiscing about Andre the Giant and said that Andre couldn't use a knife or fork.
Never could hold a fork or a knife that he could work with.
This seems pretty ridiculous to me because it takes like 2 seconds to find multiple pictures of Andre using a fork and or a knife. There are several pictures of him using chopsticks, which would probably take significantly more manual dexterity for a man with hands his size. Maybe Hogan simply meant that it was more difficult for him than it would be for a person of normal size. But Hogan also repeated the lie that Andre was 7'4" and 650 pounds.
You know, he's 7'4" and 650 pounds.
So, who knows? Either way, it's just another one of those weird cases of Hogan telling a story about a dead person who isn't there to give their account. During this same interview, Hogan brought up how, towards the end of his life, Roddy Piper was trying to surrender, then described how 2 days after Piper passed away, he received a voice message from Piper's number saying,
"I'm just loving you, my brother. I'm just walking with Jesus and loving you, my brother." I was like,
Now you might ask, would Roddy Piper really text something like that? Well, his phone did. In an interesting twist for Hogan, this actually did happen. Well, at least the voice message part did. He told this same story on A&E's WWE Legends and even played the clip.
I saw the light. I'm walking with Jesus today, my brother. Walking with Jesus, loving you and praying for you.
Personally, I think the Roddy Piper story is a sort of exception that proves the rule. Hogan isn't lying 100% of the time, but when he makes an extraordinary claim, especially when involving someone else who is no longer alive, he has to provide extraordinary evidence to back it up. On the other hand, Hogan does editorialize a bit and suggest that Piper was curious about his faith.
He started asking me about my spirituality. He really didn't connect, but he was very curious, you know.
I'm not going to psychoanalyze Hogan here or question his beliefs, mainly because, as I said earlier, I could turn that into a whole video by itself. But much of what Hogan said during this interview is about how surrendering to Christ allowed him to let go of his ego and shit like that, which is hard to take seriously when less than a year ago he was going on to numerous podcasts and lying left and right, even continuing to tell the lie about how one of his songs was inspired by a Make-A-Wish kid that tragically passed away. Before we finish the video, I want to return to the subject of the Hulkster in heaven, because shortly after I made my first Hulk Hogan video, somebody informed me of a clip that resurfaced earlier this year. For those of you who haven't watched my previous video, I'll try to sum up the Hulkster in heaven story fairly quickly. In 1995, Hogan released the album Hulk Rules by Hulk Hogan and the Wrestling Boot Band. On this album, there is a song about a fallen Hulkamaniac named Hulkster in Heaven. Over the years, Hogan has given varying origin stories for the song, but one point has remained consistent. According to the Hulkster, this story was inspired by an event that occurred at Wembley Stadium in 1992, where a Make-A-Wish kid passed away before he could watch Hogan wrestle. There are a number of problems with Hogan's story, though. Most notably, he never wrestled at Wembley Stadium in 1992. That being said, some new, old information has recently resurfaced that further contradicts this story. Earlier this year, the BBC archive channel on YouTube uploaded an interview with Hulk Hogan from the TV show Pebble Mill that took place on March 31st of 1993. This date is extremely important, so I want you to remember it. During this interview, the subject of Hogan's upcoming musical projects was brought up, and what he said here is extremely interesting.
I said, man, let's write a song for all these kids, for all this crazy stuff that's happening in the world. And it's kind of like Eric Clapton's song, Tear from Heaven.
Aside from Hogan comparing his upcoming song to Eric Clapton's Tears in Heaven, there are some very important details revealed.
Yeah, I was in my chiropractor's office, and I read People magazine, when I read about this kid, James. And I couldn't comprehend children killing children. I mean, it was something that I understand a lot of things in life, but that's something I didn't understand. So,
for the people from the UK, I imagine alarm bells and bright flashing red lights are going off, because there is only one story that could come to mind based on this time period and those details, that being the murder of James Bulger. On February 12th of 1993, 2-year-old James Bulger was abducted from a shopping center in Merseyside, England, by two 10-year-old boys, Robert Thompson and John Venables, who later took his life. Now, I'm not going to get into the specifics of this case because they aren't essential to this video. That said, this is one of the most infamous cases in UK history. It's still controversial to this day over 30 years later due to the nature of the crime and the fact that the perpetrators were so young, as well as the fact that both boys were given relatively short sentences and Thompson and Venables have been given multiple new identities over the years to protect them. With that in mind, it would be a f***ing insane thing for Hulk Hogan to claim he was going to write a song about that a month after it happened.
it's called Another Hulkamaniac in Heaven.
To try to contextualize this for my mostly American viewers, imagine John Cena going on to Good Morning America in late 2008 and saying he was going to make a tribute rap song about Kaylee Anthony. Are you beginning to understand how f***ing psychotic this situation is? At this point, some of you may be saying that Hogan didn't say the song was going to be about James Bulger specifically. Aside from the timeline of events and the details given by Hogan lining up perfectly with the case, I will grant you that there is a slim chance that wasn't what he was talking about. Nevertheless, I think it proves pretty conclusively that Hogan has been lying for decades when discussing the origins of Hulkster in Heaven. This interview took place in March of 1993, which is very crucial to the story. If Hogan really was inspired to write the song after meeting a Make-A-Wish kid who passed away at Wembley Stadium in 1992, then why is he telling an entirely different story during this interview? Furthermore, it also excludes the possibility that Hogan simply got the dates mixed up and the alleged encounter with a Make-A-Wish kid occurred during his 1994 Hulkamania tour with WCW, because he already had the idea for a version of Hulkster in Heaven a year prior. The Hulkster in Heaven story was already almost impossible, at least as Hogan described it, but this interview undermines every claim he's made about it over the years. Honestly, he may be lying here too. I think that's the most disturbing part of it, because now he's told two entirely different stories about how this song was inspired by the tragic death of children. And for what? Why do something like this? What did he have to gain? In my previous video, I talked about how Hogan's lies aren't all silly tall tales from an old man in his twilight years. Some of them have really disturbing implications for his character. I think it was bad enough that he tried to retrofit a narrative about a Make-A-Wish kid onto the Hulkster in Heaven song decades later, but this is far, far worse if you ask me. He was a month removed from this tragedy, and already thinking of ways that he could exploit it for his own gain. It's hard to think of something more cynical and depraved. I don't have anything else to add to that, really. As always, I want to thank you for watching the video, as well as liking, commenting, and subscribing. And a special thank you to my supporters on Patreon who help make these videos possible. Thank you. Squirt, Jonas Namenson, Rusty Shackelford, Jackson, Fightback CBD, Mike Roballs, Bone CK, Jake M, Mad Max Burger, Rob Rowe, Gaius Nietzsche Patton, Scott Richmond, Random Candor, Boozy Eunice, Old Neon, Timothy Lee Peterson, Julius Caesar Has Jungle Fever, Firebrand, Quasi, Snepsts, Alex, and Neem.